Iran plays a good rhetorical game, but Iran is also struggling really internally. You never know that the internal dissension in Iran, and I don't think they're a bunch of mad mullahs, will play out. So, for example, in the last 18 months, you've had women, peace, freedom as the slogan after the hijab protest. You have centrifugal forces in at least three of the provinces, including their Kurdish province, which would seek to tear Iran apart. And you've got those Sunnis who are opposed to Iran, both in their expeditionary moves into Syria, and indeed, as you can see from other groups, for example, the ISK, because Iran was part of the historic province of Khorasan back in the sort of 8th, 9th century.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest situation in the Red Sea and the recent airstrikes by the US and the UK on Houthi rebels. And I'm delighted to be joined by Major General Chip Chapman, a former British military advisor to US Central Command, who served for 33 years in the armed forces. He's also a commentator on geopolitics and security and is the author of the book Notes from a Small Military. Chip Chapman, welcome back to Frontline.
Good afternoon, James.
Let's begin with a little bit about the Houthis and their role in the region, because they've been in control in parts of Yemen for the best part of a decade now. Just talk us through their significance in the region and their role in modern-day Yemen.
I think you have to go back a little bit further than that to 1979, when there were two cataclysmic events, really. The first one was, of course, the revolution in Iran, which brought the theocracy into play there. And at the same time, the attack by 500 insurgents on the Grand Mosque in Saudi. So you already had the Sunni-Shia split. Now, the reaction in Saudi to the 1979 attack was actually more Wahhabism. And Saudi being on the border of Yemen meant that this was going to manifest itself at some stage in Yemen. Now, then, if you go forward to 1990, President Saleh, the first president of Yemen, decided in a strategic blunder of massive proportions that he would support Saddam Hussein in the war then. And that led to all the Yemeni people being basically kicked out of the Gulf War states back to Yemen with no remittances. And the only way they could get around that was to take largesse, ultimately after the war was over, from the Saudis and more Wahhabism. And it was this seeking more Wahhabism, the 65% of the Yemen which are Sunni Muslims, which led to a pushback from the Zayi Shia, of which the Houthis are Zayi Shia, 35% of Yemen, and this religious revivalism, which effectively led to the Houthis going against the state and the start of civil wars from 2004 onwards, of which there were 6. Then you spring forward to the Arab Spring of 2011, which upset the apple cart again, and finally President Saleh being kicked out in 2012. And essentially, the patronage system in Yemen broke down. There were no oil remittances, and this allowed the Houthi in 2014, allied with parts of the Yemen military, which is why they're fairly well armed, to seize parts of the country, principally the northwest, and Sana'a, the capital, which ultimately led to the intervention by both Saudi Arabia and the UAE in 2015 with Operation Decisive Storm, which was neither decisive nor a storm. And that's got us to where we are now. Now, they weren't originally powered by the Iranians, although they are supported by the Iranians now. But like all these things, the Iranians have made sure that they can now exploit this. They probably give the Houthis, we think, about £100 million of aid a year. And indeed, we just learned in the last few hours that CENTCOM interdicted a weapons shipment with component parts for ballistic and cruise missiles to them on the 11th of January. So they've been a radical group supported by Iran, which now forms part of the axis of resistance by Iran against Israel, the unity of fronts. And you see this in terms of the checkpoints and slogans around Sana'a, a beautiful old medieval UNESCO capital, which I've been to a number of times, where the slogans on the walls in Sana'a are "God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, victory for Islam." So they're really into the sort of Shiism and the acts as a resistance against both America and Israel.
I want to come back to their links to Iran in a moment, Chip, but of course you have huge experience in the Middle East and you know Yemen very well. Indeed, you've met two of the former Yemeni presidents. Just tell us about that.
Well, the most important thing that I remember, and he was not the president at the time because I was meeting Saleh, was President Hadi, or the man who became President Hadi. And you'll understand now, this was in 2009, why this stuck with me. Now, at the time, most of the work we were doing there was against AQAP, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is a very capable Al Qaeda province or franchise, really, particularly with master bomb makers. And in terms of the last jihadi superstar, with a chap called Al Laki, a Yemeni American who's proselytizing in lectures you can probably still find online, and that's really energized people. But the thing that stuck with me, and which Hadi said to me, was that the Houthi are the Hezbollah of the north. They even have the same slogan. Now, what he meant by that as the Hezbollah of the north is that their heartland is in the northwestern governorate of Sadr, and that's where their stronghold is. And just because of geography, they abut the Red Sea, which is what makes them so dangerous.
And in terms of their links to Iran, I mean, we've heard so much in the last week the phrase Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. How inextricable is the link between the Houthi leadership and the Iranian leadership?
Well, there are certainly IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force advisors with them. Whether they're independent in policy making or whether they're under the absolute remit of Iran is uncertain. What I would say is the reason that they see themselves as a Hezbollah of the north, or a rather like Hezbollah, is they're not just this ragbag of sort of rebels in flip flops. They also have social programs and want to overcome injustice and corruption. So there is this sort of move towards social problems, although the big problem, of course, in Yemen is that since the Saudi intervention, the amount of GDP which has been lost and the humanitarian aid which is needed is significant for significant parts of the country. Now, the Houthi are not the internationally recognized government of Yemen. Essentially, you have three parts to Yemen. You have the southern secessionists, you have the internationally recognized in really the south and the east, and you have the Houthis in the north and northwest. Also worth saying, of course, that it is the internationally recognized government which also has said that the Houthis should desist from their actions in the Red Sea because this is escalating tension and dragging the country into war. And Yemen has had enough wars, and most people don't want further wars in Yemen.
Let's come on to the situation in the Red Sea, where for months now Houthi rebels have been attacking commercial shipping, and of course it's one of the most significant global shipping lanes. Just talk us through the tactics we've been seeing from the Houthis.
Well, you have to first look at what is the problem that needs to be solved. And the problem that needs to be solved is what we call A2AD, that is anti-access area denial. And they can deny or have sea denial of the Red Sea and essentially the Bab el-Mandeb by either coastal defense cruise missiles, coastal defense ballistic missiles, drone attacks, or piracy type attacks where you take ships hostage. Now, it seems that the hostage taking of the ships may have been deterred by the actions of the Americans on the 1st of January. It is the others which have not yet been deterred, or maybe they have been deterred to a certain extent. Now, one thing which is missing in terms of, we should always ask ourselves, and we do, why does this matter? It used to be that we would articulate in a very good sense what was a vital interest, what was a major interest, and what was a minor interest. Now, keeping the sea lanes open and having freedom of navigation to an island nation like the UK has always been a vital interest. It's vital interest for the whole globe, including China, which is why, for example, the UN Security Council last week asked the Houthis to desist and stop from any of their attacks, because it doesn't just affect the UK and the US or the Middle East, it affects the global economy with the flows and the impact on supply chains worldwide. It has an impact both in terms of the World Bank, for example, warning of inflationary bottlenecks, and significant consequences on global growth with delayed to stop deliveries. there is only a certain finite number of containers. If the containers are delayed on a voyage, i.e. the longer route around the Cape, then that has a knock-on effect in subsequent journeys. And therefore, that is also why the average cost to move a 40-foot container has almost doubled since November. So it is vital interest, and people need to understand that it does ultimately affect them, the pound in their pocket, or what they'll be paying next year.
You mentioned a moment ago, Chip, the Houthis' slogan, God is great, death to the US, death to Israel, curse the Jews, victory for Islam. Is this a conflict they have essentially been hoping for? Did they deliberately provoke the West here?
I think that the leverage they're trying to get, of course, at the macro level, is to couple their actions with what is going on in the Gaza Israeli conflict. Now, that would be true to say if there was absolute distinction in terms of targeting, because if you look at the legal basis that the UK said that they took action, it was that it was proportionate and necessary. One of the other things we talk about in just war theory and conduct in war is distinction. That is making a clear distinction between those who are participants in the conflict and those who are not. Now, the number of attacks, which is now 29, is such that very few of those have been on clearly just Israeli targets or Israeli ships. And that is also part of the complexity of the international shipping order, when what is a flagged, what is a registered, what is a crewed, what is a owned ship is a very complex kaleidoscope of different parts. And certainly yesterday, the attack on the ship south of the Gulf of Aden was not on an Israeli ship, that was on a Marshall Island flagged ship, US owned and operated. So you could argue that they've escalated the scope of what they're doing, and I don't think the international community can tolerate that.
What was the tipping point? When did a response from the US and the UK become inevitable?
I think you have to look at five sort of phases here. The first one was the sort of I'll just outline them really. The first one was insist, the second one to desist, the third one resist, the fourth one persist, and the fifth one iron fist. So the first one, insist, is that because the number of attacks was in the sort of high 20s by the 1st of January, the key thing there was the joint statement on the 3rd of January, which was really a diplomatic warning that because of freedom of navigation and the rightful passage being a bedrock of the global trade, that they needed to stop what they were doing. Now, the large attack on the 9th of January, 21 either sea-launched ballistic missiles or cruise missiles and a number of drones, targeting both ships, HMS Diamond and US assets, was almost inevitably going to lead to a response. And that is the second phase, really, which is the attack which we did to try and get the Houthis to desist. That is, that you try and establish deterrence once more. So deterrence by punishment, hoping that that will lead to the status quo ante that existed prior to the first attack in November. Now, we're now in the third phase. That is that they seem to be in a resist mode. The fourth one is persist, is are they going to use this as a campaign, or is that just a single event, both in terms of the Houthis launching one missile a day, and if we're going to have a campaign, that is the international community, we need to be clear what we want to achieve at the end of that, and that would be the iron fist. Now, like all of this, you then come back in a circular way to insist again, and that's really your 5 parts of strategy. You know, it must be acceptable, feasible, sustainable, suitable to the circumstances, and adaptable. Now, the problem is, of course, that if you look at the Saudi operation from 2015, they never managed to achieve their outcomes. It would be catastrophic, of course, in terms of the global economy if we didn't go back to this status quo ante and that there was free flow of commerce in the Red Sea. And indeed, it's really those countries which are closest to Yemen which have most to lose. So, for example, we know that from the Suez Canal Authority that 30% of traffic is down through that canal, with 40% of lost revenue to the authority. That is essentially Egypt, and Egypt is already in a debt crisis, and therefore you might expect more action from the Egyptians, who did actually were part of the blockade of Yemen in the initial Saudi Arabian operation. But one of the things about Yemen throughout history is that it's been rather described as the Yemen being the Afghanistan of the Arabian Peninsula, where throughout history you've had the Romans, the Ottomans, the British, the Egyptians, and most latterly the Saudis, who sort of had to leave with their sort of tail wagging between their legs, as it were, when neither of them has really ever achieved their strategic objectives. And in Egypt's case, this was they did have very large numbers of forces there from 1962 to 70,000 Egyptians, and took big casualties, 26,000. So even in their sort of recent-ish history, the Egyptians might be reluctant to intervene. But I cannot see a situation where Western boots on the ground would be a tenable or credible option.
How effective would you say the US and UK airstrikes have been so far? From a purely military perspective, we'll come on to whether the Houthis are heeding the political warnings in a moment, but purely from a military perspective, how effective have they been so far?
Well, from a Western targeting perspective, I would say that the operation was pretty successful. That is, all the targets that they wished to achieve an effect on, destruction to degrade Houthi capability was actually achieved, bar the battle damage assessment, which seemed to have taken place to do a re-attack the next day. But attacking things and taking them out is not the same as establishing deterrence by altering that risk-reward calculus of the Houthis, or in a wider sphere, even the Iranians.
And if the US and the UK were hoping to deter the Houthis from continuing these attacks, is there any sign that the airstrikes are successful? I mean, given what we saw yesterday near Aden, it would imply not. I was speaking yesterday on Frontline to Dr. Matthew Hedges, who said the thing about the Houthis is they will fight down to the very last soldier.
That's true if they've taken the Iranian religious doctrine, a thing called Alavi doctrine, which is that you fuse both religious fundamentalism with a desire to fight to the last man. Now, really, in history, that doesn't necessarily happen, and we see this really with the Iranians at least twice. Although that's their doctrine, there's twice that they've had to drink from the chalice of poison, as they called it, and one of those was actually after the 1987-88 tanker war, when the Americans had had enough with the mining of the international lanes, sank 5 Iranian ships, and therefore altered the strategic calculus of the Iranians. Now, what it would take to alter the strategic calculus of the Yemenis and the Iranians is, of course, the unknown, because that is the key variable. Now, I suspect that we're back to this insist where there's diplomatic activity, particularly I would probably think from countries like China. China, as I said in the beginning, doesn't really want these flows of international trade to be disrupted. So they also have leverage over the Iranians in that sort of sphere, because although we talk about the authoritarian axis with China, Russia, Iran, each country still has its individual vital interest, and one of the vital interests of China is to have these free flows of trade, because if they can't trade, their economy tanks as well, and that also can bring instability in China.
Of course, the Houthis would say part of the justification for their campaign in the Red Sea is their opposition to the ongoing situation in Gaza. Do you think this will lead to any change in the West's approach to Gaza? I mean, it seemed to me, Chip, as if slowly but surely both the UK and the US were moving to a situation where they were calling for greater restraints on Israel's part, and if not moving towards calling for a ceasefire, then certainly urging further caution. And yet now you've got the Houthis waging this campaign. Does it not make it less likely that can happen, because it would be seen that the UK and the US were giving in to their demands?
Well, I think you can both separate those two things and you can join them together, and that is the complexity of what we've got at the moment. Now, I think most of the countries are saying that the two things are separate, that the free flow of international trade and freedom of navigation is different than what is going on in the Gaza-Israeli Israeli war. Now, it would also be correct to say at the same time that one of the things which has happened in the Israeli-Gaza war is that you already had a ballistic missile, for example, of 1,000-mile range fired from the Houthis early in the conflict towards the port of Eilat in Israel, and that was the first time in history, I think, that we had an exo-atmospheric interception of a missile that is beyond the sort of the upper reaches of the sort of atmosphere. So if you take one line, you can say it's absolutely conjoined. If you take the other line, you can say they're separate issues because there are so many nations involved in the flow of trade through the Suez Canal on a regular basis from around the world, which have absolutely nothing to do with the Israeli conflict. It would also be true, of course, to say at the same time that the object of war should always be a better peace. The better peace in the Red Sea at the moment is that free flow of trade. The better peace in the Israeli-Gaza conflict would probably be, from a Western perspective, a two-state solution. We're not going to get there at the moment. And one of the framing biases that we have in the West is to see it through our sort of just war justification, St. Thomas Aquinas type prism. The Israelis don't see it like that. They see this as an existential threat from Hamas, which they must get rid of. And that's the complication, which I don't see them stopping in the short term, regardless of what the UK or the US says, although the US, of course, has more leverage based on the amount of military aid historically that they provide each year. We are not providing military aid to the Israelis, neither are we involved in the conflict. The only aircraft which have been going to Israel from a UK perspective are those which have been doing diplomatic missions or getting people out.
On a geopolitical level, who benefits most from the crisis in the Red Sea? Is it Iran? Is it Hamas? Is it Vladimir Putin even?
I think you can overplay the Putin thing. I think one has to look at this really in terms of the Middle East has been falling apart really since the Arab Spring, and this really just plays into that. Now we've had a number of significant attacks over the last few days, which one could argue are all part of this problem of either the Iranians trying to get rid of the Americans or the wider conflict in terms of Israel seeing itself already in a multi-layered war. I'll give you some examples. The first one, which hasn't been widely reported in the Western press, is significant airstrikes by Turkey on PKK YPG positions, that is the Kurds in both Syria and Iraq. That is one of the 6 wars we've also got going, and shows the complexity because the YPG are sponsored by the Americans, particularly the Syria Democratic Front. That's important to us because they're the ones who guard, for example, all the ISIS prisoners in the 2 big camps in Syria, of which there are a significant number, 60,000, which then leads you to other policy issues about what do you do about those people, should they be returned to the West. You have a number of twilight wars, which is the IRGC trying to remove the Americans from both Iraq and Syria. The Americans are only there for one principal purpose, that is a defeat ISIS mission. ISIS are also a threat, of course, to Iran. The big attack which happened about a week ago on the anniversary of Soleimani's death was by ISK, that is the Khorasan branch of IS. And all this again shows you the mosaic of the Middle East is absolutely very, very complex. The winners from their perspective, because they've managed to produce 6 armies and utilize them without any big pushback at the moment, are really the Iranians. And the 6 armies I'm referring to are Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, and 2 particular militias, the Liwa Fatemayoun and the Liwa Zanabayab, which are Pakistani and militias and Afghanistan militias, which have been fighting for them in Syria. The pushback against Iran, though, once again illustrating some of this complexity, is that there are groups in Syria who would say that this is Iran trying to produce a new Persian empire at the expense of the Sunnis, and that would be particularly be the view, for example, of Tahrir al-Sham in Aleppo, and just to square that complexity in its real complexity, Aleppo was hit with an airstrike over the last 24 hours by the Israelis, because that's where the precision strike capabilities which are given to Hezbollah come in from Iran via Syria.
How would you assess the risk of this conflict escalating further, either Iran being more formally dragged into it, or indeed the Houthis deciding to switch their tactics, scale up their tactics? There have even been some suggestions they may start attacking vessels in the Persian Gulf. Do you see any prospect of that?
No, I think that's out of area for the Houthis. That would be a new entity if it were to be in the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, that is another choke point which could be utilised, but that is not in the range of the Houthis to go there by sort of maritime means. So I don't see the Houthis expanding their influence over there, because, of course, the east of Yemen is not their territory, the south of Yemen is not their territory. So do they have the type of assets which could get to that geographic point and do something? Not really. Now, there are people who'd say we're already in this sort of escalatory posture, but it depends how you define how many attacks there are in what geography, i.e., what is the theatre of war. Now, I really like to think of this in terms of what is the scale, endurance, and simultaneity. Now, we're seeing lots of simultaneity. We're not seeing great scale in most of these attacks, and I'm talking about throughout the Middle East at the moment. And neither are we seeing this enduring in terms of endurance, in terms of big attacks each day. It's whether you can get back to this deterrence across the piece, and what messages you have to give for that to occur. But it's a complex kaleidoscope which, if everyone had the answer, we'd all be millionaires. I remember that General Mattis, who I worked for, they used to say, if you can't ride two horses in the circus, get out of the tent. The problem with the Middle East at the moment is you're trying to ride 5 or 6 horses in the tent at the same time.
I'm not looking for an easy soundbite, but is this the most volatile the Middle East has been for a generation?
I think it is, because of the tensions which arise throughout both of the sort of Sunni Shia, the Israeli Palestinian, Israeli Iran, Turks Kurds, Hamas Israel. So there's that absolute volatility. But I don't think anyone really wants to go to a general war, because no one really profits from that. And particularly Iran. Iran plays a good rhetorical game, but Iran is also struggling really internally. You never know that the internal dissension in Iran, and I don't think they're a bunch of mad mullahs, will play out. So, for example, in the last 18 months, you've had women, peace, freedom as the slogan after the hijab protest. You have centrifugal forces in at least 3 of the provinces, including their Kurdish province, which would seek to tear Iran apart. And you've got those Sunnis who are opposed to Iran, both in their expeditionary moves into Syria, and indeed, as you can see from other groups, for example, the ISK, because Iran was part of the historic province of Khorasan back in the sort of 8th, 9th century.
How do we de-escalate tensions from here, Chip? Can we? And how likely do you think it is that we will see in the coming weeks and months a de-escalation?
Well, I don't think this thing can go on in perpetuity in terms of the Red Sea. Neither do I think the Israeli-Gaza conflict can go on in perpetuity. It really depends on how widespread it is and with what intensity. If you can get to a position where the intensity is low, I'm talking really about the Red Sea more than Gaza, although that pertains as well, then you would get to the position where insurance premiums might be manageable to escort shipping through the Red Sea. That essentially was the defensive posture of Prosperity Guardian. There is also the potential, and there is a meeting today, I believe, in Brussels from EU diplomats, of an EU mission, which might be therefore separated from what is perceived to be by the Houthis a US-UK mission. And if you therefore have an escort defensive mission, that might be something which can help to de-escalate in the future. But there's a lot of what-ifs there, and a lot of probably long-term timelines of European EU capability being brought to bear, which won't be next week or next month.
Major General Chip Chapman, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you, James.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.